Good evening, everyone. My name is Harry Frank. I'm happy to have you join me for this evening's webinar titled Self-Assessment, Goal Setting, and the Board's Annual Work Plan. The subtitle is The Cycle of Good Governance. So I want to welcome you to the Vermont School Boards Association webinar series. The School Boards Association is a membership organization made up of almost 300 school boards from all over the state of Vermont. Comprising almost 1,500 school board members. So we're pleased to have you join us this evening. Before we get going, I want to say a word about how this webinar works. Many of you may be familiar, but just to give you the details and a little bit of the VSBA flavor for webinars. So the session tonight will be presented by way of PowerPoint slides. There are many opportunities for your participation, and at any point if you have a comment or question, please chime in. You can use the microphone on your computer or the question box in your control panel. So again, writing and verbally, you can be involved. The other way we'll ask you to give us specific feedback is with a set of evaluation questions, which will appear at the end of the webinar. And then for your information, as a follow-up to tonight's session, each of you will receive an email which provides both the PowerPoint slides and other summary information. All this can also be accessed through our website, the Vermont School Boards Association website YouTube channel. Introductions. Let me tell you who's here, and of course that includes you all, so we'll be getting to your introductions in just a moment. I said at the outset my name is Harry Frank. I work here as one of two associate directors. My focus is on board training and development. I'm joined this evening by Carrie Lamb. I know she said hello earlier, but Carrie, anything else you'd like to say before we get started?
No, I just would like to let everyone know that if they have any technical difficulties at all, to call the office and I'll help you out. Our phone number here in the office, anytime you need it, is 1-800-244-8722. That's 1-800-244-8722. Anytime that you have any questions, don't hesitate to give us a call.
Great, thanks, Carrie. So introductions of the school board members that are online with us this evening. You can do this. What I'd like to do is have you say your introductions. It'll also give us a check that you can hear clearly and we can hear you. And I think what I'll do is I'll call people out because I've got a list of attendees. And what would be helpful here, I think for me and everyone else online, is to hear your name and the board on which you serve, as well as anything you want to learn from tonight's webinar. Do you have a specific question or idea you want to make sure we deal with? That would be helpful for me as we go through. So let me pull up the attendee list here. Just a moment. Okay. So let's start. Sherry Greeley, can you provide us an introduction?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. My name is Sherry Greeley, and I'm on the school board in Windsor, Vermont.
And Sherry, anything, go ahead.
Well, I'm new to the board, so everything and anything I can learn tonight would be great.
Okay, great. Got it. So I'm unmuting people as I call on them. It helps just reduce background noise. So Rama Schneider.
Yeah, I'm Rama Schneider. I'm on the school board in Williamstown, Vermont, and on the Orange North Supervisory Union Board, and I'm just here to learn whatever there is to be offered.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rama. You'll see the assessment we go through tonight has, I believe, 36 or 38 questions. We also have very brief self-reflections that can be 2 or 3 questions long. So, annually, monthly. They're built around principles, again, that are detailed in this guide we call the essential work of school boards. And fundamentally, this is another way to be concise about what this cycle looks like. We need to set goals, measure our progress or monitor the results as we work toward those goals, and use that information to make good decisions. So I hope you can hear in that cycle under essential work some of that same principle of let's be reflective, let's assess how we're doing, let's monitor. I mean, these are similar terms. And then finally, an annual work plan. One of the most useful tools boards can develop and use is a month-by-month calendar that details what is it that we are doing this month and how does it relate to what we want to accomplish overall. Again, we'll be building an example of that through the webinar, so I'm just touching on it here in general terms. All right, so this is the blank template I've been referring to, and I want to explain a little bit of what's here. This is a fairly standard planning template. I drew on a number of established resources in making the choices about what would be here in the columns. But if we move left to right across the top, number one, goal, what is this task we want to accomplish? What are we setting out to accomplish? Let's be clear about what that is so that then we can develop strategies, the ways in which we will go about accomplishing our goal. And then let's break it out even further in terms of when and who and what we need to accomplish these strategies. So there's a timeline column, there's a resource column, and then finally, although it's not the last column moving left to right, indicator. What will you measure to assess your progress toward your goal? So it's one thing to set a goal out there, to develop strategies as well. So I'm just looking now quickly at your point. I'm just going to read it out loud. We sent out a letter after the budget passed thanking our community. In that letter, we included a Facebook link that the school board disseminates information of various types at least once a week. So great. So you've got a device, a Facebook page that serves as a vehicle for communicating on an ongoing basis, and that strikes me as a great strategy to use. There's no question that electronic communications are a huge resource for boards to tap into, and something that central office staff can be helpful in developing and maintaining, but that's a great story or example to be aware of at least. All right, so let's move on now. I'm in a sense progressing down the left-hand column of our planning template, and this brings us to hiring a superintendent. Here it says to provide leadership and management, and those responsibilities are highlighted because both in law and in best practice, what we see of effective both supervisor unions and school districts is that there is a person in the superintendent's role that really does provide both leadership in the sense of direction and energy toward a shared set of goals and aspirations, as well as a steady hand to manage the intricate dynamics of a large organization like a school system. It's those two sort of partner responsibilities that we charge superintendents with. A word about the board's role here, and then I want to pose a couple questions to you. When we talk about the boards working effectively with their superintendent, it's again a bit of a parallel to this whole session. We talk about the term mutual accountability as the defining character of effective when boards and superintendents work effectively together. Mutual accountability means the board makes it very clear to the superintendent what they expect from him or her. That can be documented in a job description. It can certainly be the basis for a thoughtful evaluation process. But in any case, the board's declaring up front what it expects from the superintendent. In turn, the superintendent provides the board with comprehensive, thoughtful information that helps the board understand if we set out to accomplish these goals, how are we doing? And this is not to say that that information comes exclusively from the superintendent. Superintendent, in a way, serves as the symbolic representative of this entire school system. So there's any number of avenues that the board can get information about how the school's doing. The superintendent is certainly the person to coordinate that kind of work, but we see boards hearing directly from students, from teachers, from parents, from business owners in the community who talk to them about not only what they expect, but what they experience. And there are great examples which I guess would even overlap with community engagement, where boards have invited panels of community members to talk to them about, well, let me just be a little more specific. So in Addison Northeast, which is Bristol and Lincoln and Moncton, that northeast corner of Addison County, the board convened a panel of I think they were all business owners whose businesses were in the creative economy of sorts. So builders and artists, and they basically pulled them together because one of their aspirations for all their graduates is creativity, or there's some statement about creativity, and they wanted to get kind of feedback from this segment of the community about what are you seeing in our students who come to work for you, and what are the things that what are the skills and aptitudes and knowledge base that they should have to be successful employees for you. And it generated a great conversation that I think provided everybody both good information about what they were setting out to do, as well as evidence of how students were performing. So that's an example of this idea of setting expectations clearly and getting information that provides everyone, superintendent and board, a good picture of what kind of progress you're making toward those ends. I'll pause for a moment and just respond. Dottie had written a question: what role, if any, does the community get in the hiring of a superintendent? In both statutory terms, so in state law, and in best practice terms, the school board, and it's often the supervisory union board or the executive committee of the supervisory union board, leads the process of hiring and evaluating a superintendent. There certainly are strategies that boards employ that engage community members in that process of discussing what is it that we want in a superintendent, and even being on interview panels. So there are many ways in which the community can be involved. It's really at the discretion of the board to decide what's the best mechanism. How are we going to identify how we want to conduct this process, and your question is specific to how does the community get involved in that. So there's certainly ways, times and places where community role could be defined to be involved in the hiring process. So one other comment came in here: from Sherry, do districts / supervisory unions ask superintendents to submit an annual report that speaks to annual goals for the district? So that's a great question. Yes is the simple answer, but let's dig into that a little bit more. Oh, thanks. Rama actually just chimed in and said yes as well. But that's really where the next part of our discussion is going. So I'll certainly open the lines for further conversation, but let me take us to this. Again, these are questions drawn from the School Boards Association board self-assessment. I've highlighted by bolding one question. I want you to see the other types of questions we're asking about in this arena. And then I think we can jump in where Sherry asked and Rama responded, because the item I highlighted was the board annually evaluates the superintendent's performance. So one of the ways in which that is done is by having a review of the information the superintendent has presented. So I believe, Sherry, going back to your question, is there an annual support of sorts that speaks to annual goals? That would be one expectation the board might lay out for the superintendent's job performance, job description, as well as a basis for evaluation. But let me open the line here. Rama, I'm going to ask you to comment since you had said your board does ask the superintendent for an annual report of sorts. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, it's not really that we ask for the annual report. We do get one, and it's usually part and parcel of what goes out with the town meeting information. It's an annual report from the superintendent as far as what what's been accomplished academically and infrastructure-wise for the districts. And here we're talking, because the superintendent, we're talking naturally for the Orange North Supervisory Union, not just for Williamstown. But we don't do a very good evaluation process right now ourselves as a board, because, and we are right, and you know, to give ourselves credit on this one, we are in the beginning of going through and taking a look at what we haven't been doing and how to do a much better job, because we decided as a board at ONSU that it was very important to the board and the district to be able to hold the superintendent accountable, but it was just as important for the superintendent to understand what it was that we were going to be holding her accountable for. And so it goes both ways. The evaluation is as much for the superintendent as it is for the district and the board.
I think that's very well put. Thanks for bringing those forward together. And it's certainly a point I want to make. I'm going to move to this next slide, and then I think Dottie's got her hand up. But let me first walk us through this next slide, because I think it attempts to take what we've just been talking about and plug it into this template. So again, if our broad goal is to have a productive working relationship between the board and the superintendent, the strategies that we've identified here and I'm reinforcing here are comprehensive job description and evaluation process, and then I put a hypothetical timeline where expectations were set in place July 1, evaluation was completed by June 30th. So essentially using the fiscal year to say you set out clearly your expectations at the start of the year and you complete your assessment of them by the end of the year. And of course, in what we've come to advocate for as the most constructive process, you know, the evaluation process informs the goals or expectations for the next year, and it's a you know, continual improvement model. Now, that's not to say that there aren't times and places where a board comes to the conclusion that the superintendent's performance is not adequate, and so they're making a different decision. I'm describing a situation in which the board and superintendent are working effectively together, and so they're able to have a kind of conversation which is continually building on itself. So I want to recognize Dottie's, because she's got her hand up here, to see if you have a comment on the evaluation process.
Yes, I just wanted to say, I know, Harry, that I've spoken to you before, and you mentioned something called the 360-degree evaluation, and I'm very interested in that. When I was on the SU board last year, they came up with a job description, and then they tied the evaluation to the job description. The problem from my point of view was that there was no input from the people most directly affected. It was a very closed, it was just the board, and it was a diminishing evaluation in that the board members from Spalding would send our information in, and then the Spalding chair would reduce it and send that in, and it you know, so that's been frustrating for me, and I would like more information, you know, emailed to me or whatever on the 360-degree evaluation.
Okay, I'd be happy to do that, and let me say this very briefly. As we define 360-degree evaluation, it's both literally the process of capturing input from all perspectives. That's the metaphor, the 360 degrees of the compass. It also is a process that has a continual improvement character to it. In other words, it's really based on the idea that boards and superintendents are working together. This discussion is about how do we continue to do our work more effectively. It's not to say that a 360-degree evaluation might not bring you to the conclusion that this is not a good fit, but it's a very delicate process because, you know, as in any process where you invite people's input, there can be multiple agendas at play, and so when you open the door to lots of different perspectives, you just have to be very intentional about them and approach them with the kind of character that I described at the outset, that it's really about how do we learn from what we've done in the past to improve what we're doing in the future. And I think that's generally held to be what the potential of 360-degree evaluation is. Okay, I'm going to move after I've got one last comment here from Deneen, and she wrote, am I assuming correctly that superintendent relations, i.e. job description and evaluation, is a supervisory union board function? And the simple answer to that is yes. I had said at the outset of this section that the supervisory union board, and it's sometimes a committee, an executive committee of the supervisory union board, is the body that leads and manages the process of hiring and evaluating the superintendent. As we've discussed here, however, the 360-degree process invites involvement from other, well, from a full range of perspectives, but that responsibility does sit at the supervisory union board level. All right. Great. I really appreciate your questions and comments here. It certainly enriches the presentation, so please continue to chime in. I'll keep an eye on our time so that we conclude at 7:30, and I want to make sure we get to these other areas. So budgeting. This slide is the opening to our presentation, the component of our presentation to all board members, and there are two components here that I want to make sure you're seeing the intent. So it says develop and adopt a budget to support the vision and assure sound financial oversight. I suppose we could start at either end. So let me try starting at the end and working backwards. A board needs to be sure that dollars are being managed legally, ethically, appropriately, efficiently. So there have got to be mechanisms in place that assure that. Because if you don't have that, you can never have a conversation about what do we want to accomplish and how will the budget enable us to do that. And that's really where we want to see boards going. Frequently, the budgeting process is a question of what kind of increase can we afford. And that's certainly a parameter that boards need to pay attention to. And I certainly don't want to pretend that there aren't financial realities that we've got to navigate. It, to me, underscores even more strongly how important it is that as you develop your budget, it's about the vision. That really the initial conversation in developing the budget with the superintendent ought to include what's the most important thing we can accomplish this year or we want to make progress towards. So I'm just going to go back to build off an example I used earlier. Creativity. If you've declared in your vision for all students that you want to cultivate creativity, whether it's in problem solving or in artistic expression or some other way, and you've been really thoughtful in defining that, right? I described Addison Northeast having these community members talk about what does creativity look like in my business? What kinds of qualities am I looking for in an employee? And we figured out there are ways we can cultivate those skills and attributes in our students through this program and that program. And it might be simple to say an arts program, but it might also be, putting students into or expecting all students to decide on an independent project that they're going to pursue in their senior year, which is something an increasing number of high schools do. In any case, there are any number of ways you might set out to accomplish that, and your budget ought to be supporting, endorsing, reflecting those values and those goals that you have. So those are the twin responsibilities you have when you look at budgeting. I got a couple comments coming through. I want to move us just to this next slide and ask this question. I'm going to read comments as you get a chance to look at this. So given those responsibilities you have in budgeting, I want you to think about question 17 to begin with. The board develops a broad budget parameters and expects the administration to create the line item details. And then before I give you too much time to settle on that question, I want to jump to one more set of questions because I actually bolded all 3 questions under this section. And so I want you to think about all of these as we pause to focus on budgeting. So I'm going to give you a moment to do that. At the same time, I'm going to look at what kinds of comments I've got coming in already. And together we'll, oh dear, that's not exactly what I wanted to do, is it? Let me just go back one. Okay. So I got one comment from Rama. The board should be a part of the budget development, but school boards don't generally have the level of access required to develop a budget, and boards do not adopt budgets. We propose them. Communities adopt budgets. Well, I appreciate that. I think actually you've made that point to me previously, so I take it to heart. I certainly didn't intend to misuse language here. The point being that boards don't make final decisions about a budget, that's the vote of the community. Okay, with that in mind, I do want to come back to these questions, though. As you think about your own work but in the budget process, and again, I recognize some people are brand new to this and may not actually have been through a cycle of budgeting, but I'm particularly curious about these questions. Is the board attentive? Is part of the discussion in setting out to meet the vision balanced by what people perceive as the community's ability to pay? Are there those internal controls in place such that you can be confident funds are being managed appropriately? And more specifically, are there practices where the board monitors expenditures, revenues on a regular basis, whether it's monthly or quarterly or something to that effect? So I've got a couple hands up. I'm going to call on people, and let me start with Rama, and then I'll come over to Dottie. So Rama.
Well, I'm muted.
Yeah, I won't go back over a bit about the adoption, but I think that's a very important point because it plays right into number 19, which I'll get to in a second. But I think your question number 17 on the page that I can't see at the moment that talked about how the board provided general oversight of broad budget parameters and expects the administration to create the line item details. That's really what I was getting at with the first part of my statement on number 17. And we don't have the expertise necessarily, and I'll tell you, I have watched other school boards from previous years that got into big trouble because they tried to get into the line item budgets, and you had at the board level trying to decide how much to spend on pens and paper and books, etc., and it just led to deficits. It was horrible. Boards don't have the, we just don't have the access to the information. But I think number 19 is really important because that's where we get into the political nature, and I say political in a very good sense. It's where we get together to make these group decisions. But the board coming from the community, we are very well placed to kind of get a sense of what would be and what would not be acceptable. I want to point out in number 20, and then I'll shut up after this, that there is, and Harry, you folks would know better than me at the VSBA, but as I remember, there was something that was going through one of these bills to do with education that would have removed the requirement that local districts do annual audits and would have made it a 3-year process. Now, I don't know if that made it through or not, but not only do I think that's a horrible process, that we really need these annual audits to accomplish number 20, but I've also been told by people that do this for a living and business managers from the SU say, yes, indeed, we want to keep with these annual audits.
I think that's a critical point, and I'm not aware of that language being in any legislation that's currently under consideration, but I'm certainly not the last word on that. Let me take one more comment from Dottie, and then I had noticed that Dan Alcorn, you had joined us, and maybe I'll ask for a brief comment or introduction after we hear from Dottie. So Dottie, do you want to add here at this point?
I do. The budget process for me, which I think is a good process, is that the teachers work out budgets, which they go to the administrators. The administrators, then hone them. Then those budgets are sent to the superintendent, and I think our superintendent is very good at figuring out the budgeting process. I think our board is very attentive to the district's willingness to pay. I think our district has the ability to pay more, but the board is very sensitive to what they see as, townsfolk being willing to pay. We, in the past 5 years, have really put more internal controls in place, but we do not carefully monitor expenditure reports. We probably get expenditure reports once a year.
So let me add a comment here. I make this almost every time I do a presentation. Board members have got to understand the financial information they get. I often reflect on my own board experience and remember feeling really at a loss with how to make sense of all the documents I was receiving, and it wasn't until at least 6 months or 9 or 10 months of board service before I even asked a question about how I made sense of things. And it led to a series of good conversation and eventually some modifications to the material that we received as a board. But the underlying point here is that board members have got to be able to make sense of what's being put in front of them and be confident that it's comprehensive and effective. So before I move on, I want to invite Dan Alcorn, if you can hear me, to say a quick hello, and if there's any introductory comment or question you want to offer at this point. Dan, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can, yes. Welcome.
Thank you. The only thing I was going to comment on was what you just said, because that's what I'm experiencing now, because I'm just finishing my first year. I'm from Rutland City, and there's a lot of financial stuff that's coming through there, and during my first 6 months, 9 months, stuff like that, it's very difficult to try to make sense of all those numbers, and yes, what's going on, stuff like that. So it's funny that you just said that. That's exactly how I was feeling until I went to our superintendent, to our CFO, and asked, what does all this mean? So it's good that you said that. That's exactly how I felt the last year.
Well, I think you're not alone, and I would say, any strategy like going to the superintendent or asking to be able to sit down with the business manager, whatever it might be, I think board members should take advantage of. That said, I think it's a conversation for a board to have as a group so that everybody really is in a place where they're comfortable and confident with that information. So let me just move us forward then to the template, which includes the details on budgeting. So I played out the thought that you would budget aligned with your vision. So that would require you to have ongoing reviews so that you could use that information to most effectively plan how you're using your resources in the future, or planning to use your resources in the future. And one of the indicators I identified here, and now Dan's comment reinforces it, that monthly reports or regular reports provide good information about how resources have been used and give you good information about how you should think going forward. So that's the balance or the back and forth that really effective budgeting can generate. All right, I'm going to, okay, I got a final note here from Rama saying he had to leave, but he wanted to pass on the following. He said, I'm in my 6th year as a school board member. I continue to participate in events such as these because the learning never stops. There's always something new to learn, and what we have to share is likely to be of use to someone else. So that's a nice message on his departure. So we'll carry on in his absence and move on to the next section, which is to focus now on monitoring. This obviously has come up any number of times, including talking about budgeting information as an important source of data. There are obviously many sources of data that boards can turn to assess how you're doing. One of the things I want to underscore is to recognize what different data sources provide. We have a tendency to turn to standardized test scores as a global assessment of how our systems are doing. They're not designed to be global assessments. They're designed to tell us something quite specific about a student's learning in a particular area. Even the Common Core that we will embark upon in the coming year will assess students' performance in the language arts, in mathematics and science. It doesn't get to many of the areas we've talked about tonight, and I'll use creativity just for one example. So there's really both a challenge and an opportunity for boards to identify what is it that we want to measure, and so that's why monitoring is such a critical task to think about. The questions in front of you here are really focused on the board looking at itself. So there's kind of an interesting parallel that I'm trying to draw out, that on the one hand, you're obviously looking at how the system operates, how students are performing, and I think that's actually that's actually what is contained in questions 12 and 13. I think I was focusing for a moment on question 14, where it talks about the board's evaluating its own performance. But it is critical to be paying attention to student learning and system operations are the two broad categories we speak about, as well as the board being aware that its own performance is an arena it should be looking at and conducting the same kind of assessment and planning and continuous improvement practice. What might that look like? I said under the goal with respect to monitoring, ideally the board would have a thorough understanding of school system performance. What's an effective strategy for getting there? Well, an annual calendar that would identify what topics are being reported on. So if, and I'm using creativity just to provide a through line in tonight's presentation, if in fact creative problem solving and decision making, expression, these kinds of skills and aptitudes are values that the community has for all of its students, then let's look at how we measure that. I'll use the example I mentioned earlier that more and more high schools are requiring students to conduct individual and independent projects in order to graduate, in addition to the academic requirements that they have. And these are often a combination of hands-on experiential type learning, being in the community, and writing and speaking and creating representations of learning. So it could be entirely, it would be entirely valuable for the board to say, okay, so we want to be on community panels that hear these presentations in the spring of the year. And we might want to get information early in the year about what's the structure of this program and how are students guided through this process. So you get some of the backstory, and then you see student performance as a measure of how effectively your system is moving toward these goals. Student performance is one of the most powerful ways in which we witness and experience the value of what our school systems provide, and certainly in the context of tonight's conversation, how we can measure our progress toward those big goals we set. Are 100% of the students completing this independent project before graduation? So those kinds of questions could inform this work. The example I used here, where I talked about a calendar that had all reporting topics listed for the year, one of the indicators of the board functioning effectively would be they're getting those reports ahead of time in written form so they have time to review them and think about them before being at the meeting for presentation and discussion. So that would be one example of how a board could affect the best practice in this area. Again, I trust you'll chime in as I go. I'm keeping an eye out for hands and comments in the question box and also on the other sections. So please write me a note or raise your hand. So Dottie, it looks like you've got your hand up. Do you want to make a comment here on that last section?
I don't know. I didn't push it. I don't know what happened. So
Okay.
sorry.
All right. No, that's fine. That's why I checked. I'm going to move on then. All right. Policy is the next area I want to speak about. I want to read you a statement that we've taken from the National School Board Association because I think it very concisely characterizes how we think about school board policy. So this is taken from their material. When we speak about school board policy, we speak about ideas with the power to set directions for the school system, to bring about prudent action by the administration, the staff, and the board itself. A soundly constructed policy will tell the administration enough so that it can get working on the task in accordance with the board's wishes. The point and the character of that statement is to say policy is a statement of broad intent, provides boundaries that provide a lot of latitude. So their direction, they're not all the detail of what the work is. So I want to take a look at this set of questions. And again, I've highlighted one by bolding it to prompt boards to think about how do we fulfill our policy responsibilities. One of the most critical responsibilities you have is to make sure that your policies are updated and comprehensive. So is there a system in place to accomplish that on an ongoing basis? And it says here on every 3 to 5 year cycle. So that's a critical consideration. I'm going to move us to the planning template and again look for people's comments and questions as I go. So a way this might look on your work plan is to say our goal here is to have a comprehensive and effective set of policies. Our strategy is to have that ongoing process for updating it on a 3 to 5 year cycle. Many boards assign a committee to conduct that work. Other boards have it as a regular component of their agenda. One of the messages by keeping it in your month-to-month work is to know that you're paying attention to it. The VSBA also provides a consultation service specific to policy. Among other things you can find on our website is what we call our model policy manual. And that has all the required and suggested policies for Vermont school boards. It's a good reference, and our staff also can conduct comprehensive audits of board policies. Just as a sort of general reference, our model policy manual now has about 60 policies in it. And I use that just as a reference because sometimes we encounter policy books that are several hundred pages long, and usually what that indicates is that there are a lot more detailed procedures included rather than the kinds of broad policies that I was describing when I read the National School Boards Association comment. Okay, a quick response here. Dottie had written, I'm curious as to how you arrived at the model policies. So the simple answer is, sorry, I think Carrie will pick up the phone for a moment. So the simple answer is any law that's passed that has a policy implication we pay attention to and often have a hand in shaping, and so we pay attention to what's being passed into law. We also, I think, draw on a bank of experience for a set of policies so those would be the required policies, those that are actually legislated in state law, and then the suggested policies are, I think, have grown really over the experience of time from boards that have developed policies to deal with probably in many cases circumstances that they hadn't anticipated, and so we try to put those in front to be as proactive and preventive as possible. All right. The last section is I think I referenced it in the beginning as legal responsibilities. To me, it's this broad category of legal boundaries, ethical boundaries, and ultimately effective operations. It's certainly critical, and one of the required policies is a conflict of interest policy. Board members are not allowed to participate in a decision from which they may benefit through a contract or agreement. The strategy we recommend boards use to address this question ahead of time is to discuss and sign the Code of Ethics. There's a model Code of Ethics. I know the page reference is 75 in our manual, but I see it's not listed here, but I think it was Dottie, maybe you had asked earlier for page references, so I'll provide some of those. This I think, serves as a reminder, but it also is one of those legal boundaries. A board has power as a body, as a quorum, or as at least a quorum, which means a majority of the board, or quorums can be set at different levels, but they need to at least be a majority. That's where and when a board has power. Individuals don't have powers as members of a board, and so that's what this reminder is intended to underscore. This is probably a broad reminder that should, I think, be made throughout the session, this idea that boards serve to provide oversight. That was some of the content of the opening slide. Assuring that schools are well run but don't run them. And I spoke to both the temptation and the challenge of not digging into the daily operations of schools, because oftentimes board members have great ideas and insights into how things can function effectively. It's not to say you can't be involved in conversations about the day-to-day life of the school, but the job of the board is to make sure that that system is operating well and not to weigh into the day-to-day mechanics of it. Board meetings are, by virtue of open meeting law, and I think I'll actually pull up these references as well, are required to occur in public. They must follow open meeting law, which includes very clear boundaries for the use of executive session, which is designed to manage confidential issues to protect people's privacy and not put the board at a disadvantage in instances like negotiating real estate deals. But there are 7 reasons for entering executive session, and those are the only reasons that should be used for that purpose. Oh, good. I do have the reference here on where open meeting law is referenced. But the other comment I want to make is the one higher up about board meetings are in public, but they are not meetings of the public. One of the more challenging boundaries for boards to draw with members of their community is how community members participate in board meetings. Open meeting law requires that you have a public comment period in your meeting. Best practice is to have it at the beginning of the meeting, and typically it's a 10 to 15 minute time period. It's for informational purposes, meaning it's an opportunity for people in the community who have ideas and concerns to voice those to the board. So that's the way in which the public has an opportunity to participate. One of the pitfalls boards often find themselves in is getting into a discussion during public comment period. I'll offer this by way of a caution. If the board chooses to enter into a discussion with the community members that come to a given meeting, it would give the people that came that night the impression that they have a voice in making this decision. Now, it's not to say their ideas and opinions, let alone concerns, aren't important to the board and wouldn't be taken into consideration. But it's the board members who have been elected or appointed to serve every child and every taxpayer who are the members of the community who will discuss issues and come to a decision. And it's important that the community understands that, albeit in a thoughtful way. I'm not suggesting people I think it's important to be respectful to community members that come and give them their opportunity to speak. I'm just cautioning you to be able to also strike that important balance about what the board's role is and what the community's role is. So the final set of questions have to do with these broad responsibilities, legal and ethical. I want to focus on these last two because they really sort of underscore the recommendations I was making. So they may be a little bit less of a discussion than some points I'd like to make. I do see, before I get to that, that Sherry is asking about how to raise her hand. I'm assuming, Sherry, that means you want to make a comment, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And Sherry, would you go ahead? All right, well, Sherry, I don't hear you, so I'm going to continue on, and if you'd like to add in, please do. I'm going to leave your microphone on at this point. So these self-assessment questions for the board really prompt the kinds of discussions I was mentioning earlier. The one that I mentioned rather quickly was the code of conduct. One of the ways for a board to grapple with these questions, whether it's conflict of interest or board members operating outside the confines of the board, is to have a discussion that really gives people a chance to talk about what are our commitments, what do we expect of each other, and while it's not a legally binding document, the act of signing it serves as a symbolic demonstration of people's commitment to that. Dottie's question, is the code of conduct different from the code of ethics? I think the two are used synonymously. Sometimes I refer to them that way, so I believe that's the case. There was one last question I wanted to highlight here. And again, these are all in the context of a comprehensive assessment that we provide for boards to look at the board's performance and how it's overseeing the performance of the school system. Is this balance about once a board decision is made, dissenting board members respect the board's decision even if they continue to disagree. It's a subject of a lot of discussion in many boards. What we say is, by committing to be a member of this board, you're committing to the process the board has arrived at for decision making, and typically that's a vote of the majority. It's not to say that if a vote goes against you that all of a sudden you, in your heart, change what you think and believe. It is saying that if you've participated in this board process, that you will go forward supporting the decision of the board. Now, it's also not to say that you can't bring the question back to the board, but it is to say that that question ought to come back through the processes the board has in place, and that likely would be putting something on an agenda and bringing new information to the table for people to discuss, as opposed to going out in the community and being critical of the board's decision. So these are dynamics that boards really ought to pay attention to, and so in this section here regarding legal responsibilities, I talk about or identify the code of ethics as a valuable strategy, and that making use of the annual reorganization meeting, which is typically when new board members come on in the spring, and or a summer retreat, really provides the opportunity to have some of these bigger discussions. So in closing, I want to refer you, here's a couple other references to pages in our resource manual. I had mentioned we've worked through many of the questions in our comprehensive assessment. There are also shorter, more focused assessment tools that boards can use to measure their effectiveness on a meeting-by-meeting basis, and that's what's highlighted here. And then the final slide of content I touched on when I talked about public comment, and I mentioned that public comment is for information purposes. One of the other tools that I point board members to is this sample agenda that we have in our book and the thought process behind developing an effective agenda. And one of the most useful tools we identify is labeling agenda items as either information, discussion, or decision. And it's both a good guide for the board as well as anybody else that is there to participate in the session. So I'm going to come to a close here. I always put up upcoming events, so I'm going to leave this slide up for you. And thank you for being part of this evening's session. As I mentioned at the outset, the follow-up will include the slides from tonight's presentation, the text of the questions, and other details. You can access it at any point off our website. It usually takes about a week to 10 days to get everything there. As with all of our sessions, having people's contributions really enriches it. So I want to thank you all for participating. Hope we'll see you, if not at next week's session on community engagement at one of these dates coming up, or at any other point we're available. So you can turn to the School Boards Association for information at any point. As you leave, you'll be prompted with evaluation questions. It's very helpful for us to get your feedback, so look forward to that. And again, thanks for participating.